Okay, so hey everybody, thank you for coming. My name is John, and today's teach-in is going to be about the first and second Intifada. They're broken up, over about 13 years, but we're treating them together because, they kind of mark a specific period within the Palestinian struggle. So, Intifada means shaking off. I thought about including a Taylor Swift meme, but didn't think that would be appropriate. And it comes to mean, uprising. Originally, it's used in that sense in Iraq in the 1950s, but it comes to designate two particular episodes of Palestinian resistance. The first Intifada, which started in '87, and kind of things are percolating a bit before that, but starts in '87, ends in '93, and the second Intifada, which starts in 2000 and goes to about 2005. Though some people kind of date the end of it a bit earlier. It's important to understand that there's an organized component to both of these, and then also a sort of stochastic individual actor piece as well. The first Intifada marks a really sharp transition in the struggle between Palestine and Israel, because it is the first large-scale post-67 internal to Gaza and the West Bank struggle. Prior to that period, the locus of Palestinian resistance to Israel was living in exile, whether that's in Egypt or Syria or crucially Lebanon. And after Lebanon, Tunis, the organizations that resisted Israel, were all abroad. So the first Intifada is the first thing that's sort of directed and driven by the people of Palestine. And, it goes on to have a complicated political relationship to some of those exile organizations that thought of themselves as more properly in charge. But it's like a kind of first organic moment of mass resistance. And the second Intifada marks another transition, specifically the collapse of the peace process. And in the context of looking back, the Oslo Accords seems like half measures and kind of foolishness on the part of, the PLO and PA. But at the time, they genuinely represented kind of a hope for a better future of some kind. And that's something that, by the time of the second Intifada is just over. And from at that point, we sort of enter the kind of situation that we've been in since then, sporadic violence, certain kinds of organized resistance, but there hasn't been, until really October 7th, anything with the scale and scope of the first and second Intifada. And it also, is the end of kind of hope for in certain respects. Obviously, we're all hopeful about a better Palestine, but a free Palestine, but very concretely, there are a lot of organizing kind of dissolved over the course of the 90s. And so the second Intifada is as much the mark of despair and anything else. So a couple things I wanted to highlight, just broad context stuff. The first Intifada was mostly peaceful. The second was mostly not. The distance between them is a consequence of many things, like that loss of hope I just pointed to, but also the failure of the peace process, specifically the Oslo Accords. That's something that's been touched on in other teach-ins and will be developed further in the future. But the Oslo Accords, effectively, people weren't happy with them. Palestine, Palestinians had to give up a lot in the short run in return for promises that were kind of deferred by the Israeli state. As a consequence of that, the political organization that presided over the Oslo Accords, and that was sort of the government of Palestine self-government, Fatah, which is the organization of Yasser Arafat, they sort of came to be discredited because of their role in trying to police Palestinians to keep with the Oslo Accords. There are also, there's a lot of kind of insider baseball tensions between some of the civilian leadership that would go on to lead the first Intifada. And, Fatah's leadership structure, which was largely in exile, and wanted to claim, a kind of position as like the preeminent, like principal negotiator for the Palestinian people. So really, over the course of the 90s, there's a loss of faith in Fatah's vision of the future, and this is also, even though Hamas is not yet what they will become, this is sort of the period in which Hamas like rises to prominence. The spatial changes brought about by the points 1 and 2, organizing and resistance had to change because people had less mobility. One crucial feature of the Oslo Accords was the division of Palestinian land, and with different rules, governing each section. They're labeled A, B, and C. But as a result, some of the spatial, the freedom of movement gave the people of the first Intifada a degree of flexibility that organizers during the second Intifada wouldn't necessarily enjoy. And this kind of brings me to a generalization, but pacifism was a tactical and strategic choice in the first Intifada. Similarly, violence was a tactical and strategic choice in the second. Nonviolence is perhaps like a moral stance, but it's also a procedural and pragmatic consideration. And the conditions that gave rise to kind of like mass citizen-based organizing and self-organizing and workers' councils kind of just weren't there. They were like those functions got absorbed by the government. They weren't something people were doing for themselves, and so possibilities for autonomous resistance went away. And quickly, I wanted to just show you 4 faces and names. We have on the far left Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin. I'm going to also not pronounce the Israeli names correctly because, well, at least Yitzhak Rabin, I don't know. Mahmoud Abbas and Ariel Sharon. Each of the, there are other people who are really important to understanding the period from the first Intifada and the second Intifada, like the Oslo Accord interregnum in between. But these 4 people would go on to, have an inordinate say over what happened in that time period. Yasser Arafat was legendary leader of Fatah, who by the time of the first Intifada, the PLO has been pushed out of southern Lebanon. They're kind of a shadow of themselves. They don't have the relationships in Gaza and the West Bank that they once did. They're kind of at a remove, and they're struggling to find a place for themselves. But they rightly feel that, rightly in their minds, that they are the ones to help build a free Palestine. So, which goes on to be important later. Yitzhak Rabin was ultimately he was assassinated for his part in the peace process in the 90s by a militant from what would become Ben Gvir, the current Israeli security minister's kind of militia that he's affiliated with. But Rabin basically was an incredibly cruel member of the Labor Party. He was the internal security minister during the first Intifada, but eventually he would be elected kind of in a landslide to be, the leader of Israel. There was genuinely in the Israeli public was sufficiently shocked at their violent reprisal, their own security forces' violent treatment of Palestinians, and so not to mention international pressure. I don't know, but he was elected to begin the peace process and assassinated for it. We joked beforehand that he had banked enough cruelty to have the kind of political authority within Israel to pursue peace. And being flip aside, I think that's pretty apt. Mahmoud Abbas is technically, the head of the Palestinian Authority today. At this time, he is under Yasser Arafat. He plays a crucial role eventually in negotiating the Oslo Accords. But over the course of the second Intifada, his kind of star rises, and he basically is initially imposed by the U.S. As president of and head of the PLO. he resigns, but is eventually reelected, and it's him who signs a peace agreement that ends the Second Intifada. Generally, he's seen as like a traitor and a collaborator at this point in time, but that wasn't necessarily his reputation at the time. And then Ariel Sharon, he was sort of Benjamin Netanyahu's chief rival within Likud for like many, many years until his death. He has done a lot of terrible things. He led commando raids against Egypt and Palestinian people in like the 60s and 70s. He's responsible directly for a massacre that killed 167 people, like in the lead up to 67. He also led the invasion of Lebanon, initially to dislodge the PLO, eventually to besiege Beirut for reasons that are kind of opaque to me. And he's generally a monster. And he will directly incite the Second Intifada, but he also is the Israeli prime minister who ends it, and that's not because he has any kind of crisis of conscience. There's no like moral, oh, what have I done? There's no, like conversion experience. He just realizes it's not expedient to be waging like an asymmetric war 24/7. But yeah, so first Intifada, I chose this image because, children throwing rocks at tanks is an iconic like image of Palestinian resistance. And, there's like a million photos like this. So in the lead up to the first Intifada, I'm just gonna quickly go through this. 1967, and we covered this recently in a previous teaching. But after the 67 war, Israel ends up occupying Gaza and the West Bank. They begin greater expropriation of land. They're directly in charge of those places the way they weren't before. At the time, Palestine is not divided physically the way it is. Like they haven't, the wall has not yet entered as like a kind of like dominant spatial metaphor or whatever. And the Israelis like principal preoccupations too, because a lot of Palestinian resistances elsewhere are to prevent the constitution of like a Palestinian national consciousness. And so this takes a lot of forms, but a good example is people organized spontaneous work councils to organize clearing brush or maintaining public areas of villages, cities, communities. And like that's something that Israel would violently crack down on because they saw it as a kind of reflexive, kind of less ideological, and therefore less exploitable manifestation of like a Palestinian self-consciousness that kind of calls for government might emerge out of. And they also sought like the economic integration of Palestinians mostly as like unskilled surplus labor, but there was a greater degree of mobility between Palestine and Israel at the time. And so like the kinds of like the more Palestinians functionally. And they thought by, even if they're paying them poverty wages, there's like a very self-conscious sense of like, if people's lives just get wrapped up in the day-to-day functioning of Israel and the Israeli economy, eventually this problem will sort itself out. And this is just an important point that I touched on. There's a comparative freedom of movement within Palestine relative to the present. In 85, I believe it was, I'm sure somebody in the crowd knows better than me, the PLO was pushed out of Lebanon by Israel's military invasion. They're kind of, chilling in Tunis, basically. Yasser Arafat and most of the leadership. Some people were still in Lebanon, some people were in Syria, but the majority of their command structure was Tunis. Hamas was not yet founded. Like Hamas kind of gets founded. I want to say I should know this, but it's like 83, 85. Concomitant with that, there's not like within Gaza and the West Bank. There are some fighters, but there's not like the presence of kind of like the military infrastructure that we now kind of associate with Palestinian resistance. They had weapons caches. there were many organizations that maintained their own popular front, the communists, democratic front, but there wasn't the presence of, there wasn't so much like militarized energy there. And then, into the like broader political milieu of Palestine, where you have an organization that thinks it should be in charge, the PLO, but they're far away. You have rising organizations like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. You also have like small villages and towns begin organizing councils to provision for themselves. So like those work councils I mentioned earlier, but also, education and health services. And into this mix, there's a lot of like aid organizations, there are universities, but yeah.
We have a clear idea of the role, the waning of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Eastern Bloc played in PLO's sort of, waning of influence themselves,
Sure.
PFL,
Sure.
overtly Marxist organizations kind of, not even kind of the depth they had in 70.
Yeah. So short answer is I don't know, but very concretely, I would emphasize that of every kind of political party active within Palestine, the communists were the ones that were most supportive of the kind of like autonomous workers organization, and I think they had a degree of organizational capacity and a presence at the universities that some of the other organizations aren't. So I can't speak to their connection to the broader like Soviet Union and worldwide communism. I would emphasize the Soviet States is probably Israel's greatest ally, and so there is an element of like and I also I don't know a lot about the internal politics, but the communism of the non-aligned movement is kind of like the third way relative to the Soviet Union, and historically, Palestine had relationships, in that direction, but I don't know enough about that.
Fair. Thank you.
Yeah. So the inciting incident for the first Intifada on December 8th, an Israeli military truck crashed into several Palestinian vehicles. They were at a checkpoint waiting to go home, kind of something that's been touched on a lot throughout these are the series of checkpoints that govern how Palestinians interact with and travel to Israel. There were less of them at the time, they still existed. And 3 people were killed immediately, 7 people were injured. And it was going to the Jabalia refugee camp, which was one of the more populous ones. So there were lots of people in line on both ends, waiting to go through that saw this. Word spread very quickly. In the coming days and weeks, like tens of thousands of people would attend the funerals for the deceased. But almost immediately the next day, there were protest crowds gathering, but a specific individual threw a Molotov at an Israeli patrol car in East Jerusalem. They were shot and killed. And this was similarly, there were a lot of people around who saw it. The word spread quickly. There was already kind of ambient tension because of the events of the day before. And this is really the catalyzing event that leads to, thousands and thousands of people taking the streets. Beyond normal protest tactics, the first Intifada also included an economic boycott. People stopped going to work. People in Jerusalem, like Arabic business owners in Jerusalem, did not open their shops or their businesses. Arab Israelis, out of solidarity, also didn't go to work and didn't, open businesses that they owned. There were over time, this would extend to people with tax payments, and they, a lot of different stuff, and the traditional protest tactics were in Palestine at the time or stuff like blocking roads. People would light tire fires because they smell really bad and are annoying to put out and deal with. So there are concrete protest actions going on, but then there's also a larger scale mobilization and a refusal to engage with Israel's economy. So I'm just gonna kind of run through some significant dates. We've already covered the inciting incident and the next day. where, the first martyr of the Intifada was killed for throwing a Molotov cocktail. The next major event I pulled out is the assassination of Abu Jihad. So he was the PLO leader in exile in Tunis, who was most plugged in to what was going on in Gaza and the West Bank. That was his specific remit within the broader organization. And he had personally very strong relationships with a lot of the on-the-ground organizers of these workers and citizens councils. Israel, very explicitly, and you see it breaks out in December, in April, they're sending death squads to kill, PLO leadership, because the PLO, just like Israel, was kind of surprised by the strength of the, mass mobilization, but there were factions within the PLO who kind of resented that because it sort of sidelines them, but they came to endorse and attempt to play a coordinating role. And the assassination of Abu Jihad really rendered them less effective, rendered their kind of diplomatic communications to people in Gaza and the West Bank. He just had the lay of the land and other people did not. And that would go on to characterize the PLO's relationship with some of those civilian leaders throughout the Oslo Accords. They would get sidelined in favor of people who've been in exile. Many of them had been to Gaza or the West Bank since '67. So he's like a crucial piece in rendering resistance less effective. Later in 1988, the PLO, who is this whole time trying to negotiate with the U.S. and Israel to push forward some kind of hey, we'll rein the Intifada in. Let us have a seat at the table. Let's have a lasting peace. Let's talk about government. So that leads to them accepting UN Resolution 242 and 338. UN Resolution 242, offhand, I don't know the text, but it's basically the one that required the various Arabic states to recognize the right of Israel to exist. And 338 is kind of a restatement of that. And so this marks a turning point and is yet another one of those things that, at the time, the PLO decided to do for specific, concrete, logistical, pragmatic reasons. In the fullness of time, it's a thing that kind of undercuts their moral authority. In July, Jordan renounces their claim to the West Bank. This is generally seen and I want to emphasize all throughout this, there are mass demonstrations, is violent police reprisal. I'm just pulling these out as I think kind of highlight events. But Jordan renounces its claim to Palestine as significant because up until that point, Jordan still insisted the West Bank belonged to them. So this kind of throws the leadership of the Intifada and the PLO into a position where they're in charge of their fate moving forward. October 8th, 1990, the Al-Aqsa massacre, which was basically Israeli cops killed 11 people at the Al-Aqsa temple complex. And, this made national news. People were horrified by it, and think about how, deaf Americans are to, much more severe violence. And at the time, people could still be jaded by what was happening there and disappointed. And this was a major event that kind of forced the Israeli government to reconsider how they had been proceeding. So over the course of the first Intifada, the Gulf War happens. And Saddam Hussein had long been a supporter of Palestine and was one of the most vocal supporters of Palestine, specifically the PLO. And the PLO supported, were one of the only large scale Arabic groups in the entire region to kind of defend Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, mostly out of solidarity. He, as you all know, kind of lost that war very rapidly. So this had the consequence of kind of isolating the PLO and Palestinian organizers from some of the oil-rich Gulf states that, and this is important because it kind of illustrates one of the central dynamics moving forward, which is that all all the rich oil countries only care about Palestine kind of when it's convenient for them, and are very happy to abandon them when it's not. So in '92, Yitzhak Rabin is elected vice president. There's like a genuine mandate to pursue peace. And in '93, the first Oslo Accord is signed. Rabin is killed like a year or so later. But this is genuinely a hopeful moment in a lot of people's minds, and brings two consequences. So for the first time, the two-state solution was seriously proposed. It's something that, like, within the PLO, and like we now two-state solution not pop. Like it's ostensibly what the U.S. thinks we ought to be doing there. It's ostensibly like on paper what the Israeli government's peace plan commits them to. But at the time, it was genuinely enjoyed like broader acceptance. There were notable opposition, specifically Hamas. I think the Communist Party opposed, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad opposed. But like the citizen mobilization plus Israel's violent reprisal of that, like genuinely and Israeli citizens and the international community, like recoiling in horror at that stuff, genuinely led people to think that they could get peace. And so the two-state solution along the 1967 borders was, contested, but there was support for it. And that's what they would go on to pursue throughout Oslo. Fatah and the PLO are recognized as the chief legitimate organizations representing Palestine. Israel crucially recognizes the right of Palestine to self-government, which is not the same as recognizing Palestinian statehood. And that's an important distinction. Like the Oslo Accords position statehood as something we're going to march towards, rather than, like this is what you have immediately. Regardless of background or belief, those interested in armed struggle against Israel were pushed towards organizations like Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. This is like a crucial thing for understanding some of the internal politics subsequently. Like people wanted to fight, people wanted to free Palestine, people resented Israel, and Fatah was, there was hope around the possibility of a lasting peace. But there was also a lot of animosity to that, and a lot of people didn't want to lay down their arms, even if they did not want open resumption of hostilities. And so this plays a role in kind of shifting the internal balance of power. Oslo Accords go on throughout the '90s. That's the subject of a different teach-in. I'm gonna jump ahead to the second Intifada. Yet another photo of a kid throwing a rock at a tank. This is a very iconic one from second Intifada. So, for context, in the lead up to the second Intifada, Oslo Accords not going well. People aren't very happy with them. Palestinians are inconvenienced in the day-to-day sense. Like imagine the degradation of having to go through 2 to 5 checkpoints to go to your job and get home. This is something people touched on in other teachings, but this is the beginning of that kind of spatial organization of day-to-day life for people. The PA and by extension Fatah are kind of discredited by their role in enforcing the Oslo Accords, always seen as a compromise. The lived reality of the Oslo Accords required the Palestinian government, such as it was, to effectively police Palestinians to get them to agree to the terms of this larger piece of Israel. And, that's not very popular. Israel's not very popular. And because Palestine had to give up so much in the short run, people are, they find themselves asking, like, why are we doing any of this? The PA doesn't represent us. They're just kind of like a ghetto policeman. So tremendous reduction in freedom of movement for Palestinians that has crucial effect, knock-on effects in people's ability to just, coordinate educational activities, to coordinate health and food services. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a far-right extremist. Whatever we might think of him, and he is in fact a bad man. He had the gravitas and sort of the credibility in aspects of the Israeli right to push for a peace. And so his assassination by people further to the right kind of marks, like there isn't a comparable figure with moral authority who can say I'm not soft, and push this process forward. And also all throughout this, there's ostensibly like a military demobilization. Both sides are quietly making plans for hostilities to resume. So it seems like they didn't really, especially the Israelis, didn't really think it would be a lasting peace. And on the Palestinian end of the spectrum, like I think Fatah was prepared for hostilities to resume, but didn't really orient themselves that way. Whereas many other organizations did. They spent the time like arming themselves. They developed new rockets, and they were quietly preparing for like the resumption of hostilities. Which came, there are two incidents that really like tee things off, and they happened within a couple of months of one another. So in 2000, there was a Camp David summit, and it was between Yasser Arafat, who you see on the left, shaking hands with the then Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak. Yasser, this is the second to last serious attempt at a lasting peace along the two-state, kind of plan developed over in the 90s. Yasser Arafat rejects. He does that for a lot of reasons, but kind of crucially, he felt that he had compromised a lot and hurt his own credibility and hurt Fatah's credibility, and that they hadn't gotten enough in return. Like they didn't think the Israelis were in good faith. And kind of on the Israeli side, there's a general sense from the Israeli public of like, we kind of got a lot of what we wanted. Why would we give them anything? We're kind of, in control of stuff. And so Barak's position was considerably like weakened. This is like the last time that an Israeli government really makes a credible go of it. And then the second thing, Ariel Sharon and like a bunch of Likud dignitaries go to visit the Al-Aqsa complex. They claimed they had like permission from Palestinian authorities. That's something that virtually everyone in Palestine disputes to this day. But they basically incited a riot. They went in with hundreds of armed security guards, and they just kind of wanted to walk around the place to show that they could. And those two things really, like the conflagration of emerging from the riot in response to like a kind of peremptory way that Ariel Sharon did that is what becomes the second Intifada. So Camp David Summit, Ariel Sharon's visit to Al-Aqsa, demonstrations break out around East Jerusalem. The Israeli police initially are kind of doing the stuff that they did in the 80s. They're using batons and rubber bullets, but one of the on-the-ground police commanders is knocked unconscious by a thrown stone, and so they give the go-ahead to use live ammunition. And I want to say something like 70 people were killed and like hundreds were injured in the ensuing massacre. Almost immediately, like protests keep going, but almost immediately there's a general strike. Both again, Palestinians who work in Israel and Arab Israelis are refusing to go to work. They're not engaging. In response to this, kind of Israeli mobs riot in East Jerusalem. You see a lot of Arabic businesses get like stones thrown through their windows. There's a lot of violence. And kind of like in the immediate aftermath of that, like 2 Israelis are lynched in Ramallah. They're arrested by the Palestinian police for violating the terms. The crowd basically breaks in and kills them. And this kind of goes on to, and this is one of the crucial things distinguishing the second Intifada from the first Intifada. Like there are, aspects of stochastic violence like this, and it's almost as if like both groups of citizens are engaged in like kind of like mutual rioting, except Israel has all the military might and police power to sort of like protect their rioters. Like almost, you know, after this, like things keep at like a, you know, kind of simmering. There's one last summit between Arafat and Barak in like the Taba summit at a place in Sinai Peninsula, and it doesn't go well. This is you know, it was Camp David summit, penultimate peace talks. This is the final peace talk. It does not go well. Kind of from this point on, too, Arafat is effectively sidelined. He still wields a lot of like kind of political authority and charisma, but this is kind of the last moment where he is the crucial figure whose hands are steering the ship. And almost immediately after that, the Likud party, with Benjamin Netanyahu and Ariel Sharon competing to see who will get to run and be prime minister, the Likud party forces a special election and they force Barak out. Ariel Sharon wins, and this is like a pretty sharp repudiation of the peace process by Israel itself. And Ariel Sharon refuses to meet with Yasser Arafat or really any like, high-ranking Fatah people who could negotiate. Violent, you know, like there, and all throughout this, there are massacres from Israel against Palestinians. There are riots of, you know, Palestinians against Israeli authority. There are there's internal fighting between various Palestinian factions. It's somewhat muted, but it is present as kind of a jockey for who will get to decide what happens next. And there also crucially is suicide, like largely driven by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But it, like, and in response to a particular suicide bombing in May 2001, Israel begins using planes to bomb Palestine for the first time in decades. This represents like a stark escalation. You know, Israel continued to deploy helicopters, but there's a great difference in emphasis in the kind of like armament that a helicopter and a plane can bear. And this is something that like is kind of a switch road for Israel. They haven't stopped bombing, you know, using planes to bomb from the air or drones since then. And it was seen at the time as like a, you know, dramatic escalation, you know, around the globe. Like the international community was in horror, and you know, compare that to the public, you know, the international community's reaction now. So this basically continues on. There's several like prominent battles, like Arafat's compound in Ramallah is besieged. There's pitched battle in Bethlehem. This is a lot of fighting between like groups of militants and Israelis. Under duress from America, who like Arafat appoints Mahmoud Abbas president. Their hope, like Abbas had been one of the principal negotiators during the Oslo Accords under Arafat, like working out economic details and stuff like that. And you know, it was genuinely felt that he was a person that it was thought like the Israelis would deal with because the Americans would deal with it. And Arafat, who is besieged, he's isolated politically. You know, like about 7 months later, Arafat falls ill, and he ends up evacuated to Paris, where he dies. There's a lot of speculation that he was assassinated. The French and the Russians said no, he wasn't. He died of natural causes. It's unclear. He died very suddenly, and this kind of leaves a power vacuum. Because there is not a comparable figure with the moral authority, experience within the Palestinian resistance, and kind of from this point on, no one person is able to wield the influence that Arafat did, like wrongly or rightly, in how we view his legacy. You know, there's a dramatic loss of coordinating capacity with him. And, you know, in February 2005, the Palestinian Authority signed a peace treaty with Israel. Subsequently, like Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad did not agree to it. Abbas gets them to agree to like a a kind of truce days later, but they do not agree to the specific treaty that was worked out. So some consequences of the Second Intifada. Abbas and Fatah, they've just won an election. Like Abbas is affirmed as president, but it'll be the last election that they win, so it's kind of a last grasp. Oslo Accords, Arafat's passing, and the Second Intifada, and their internal politicking around all of this stuff decisively weakened Fatah, who'd never again kind of command widespread moral authority. This is really the beginning of the end for them. A year later, there is another election where Hamas wins the majority of the legislative seats, which is kind of what leads to the split between Gaza and the West Bank. The Second Intifada signaled both an intensification and normalization of increasingly violent repression on the part of the Israelis. Like the Israelis stopped reaching for rubber bullets first, from the air, and there would never again be the sort of internal this operating the colonial state sure takes a mortal toll on us. Like that attitude fades from public life. And people can point to liberal Zionist writers who denounce one or another aspect of Israel's occupation, but there isn't there's not a intellectually honest reckoning with kind of what that entails present in that period. That's why they always side the way that they do. And by the end of the Second Intifada, partly because of it, partly because of just the passage of time, most of the old guard leadership in Palestine had passed. So this, Hamas has risen to prominence. They're comparatively younger. A lot of the people who go on leadership within Fatah, other than Abbas, they haven't really lived through a lot of the events previously. It's a younger set kind of takes over. So I wanted to end on that note. First and Second Intifadas represent decisive changes in the nature of the Palestinian resistance. The First Intifada was a genuine, peaceful mass organization that sought to, build an alternative society to the one on offer from Israel and to the kind of abstract utopian vision of a distant PLO. And, it culminated in an attempt at a lasting peace that seems foolish, in hindsight, but was genuinely a hopeful moment. And the Second Intifada represents the kind of collapse of that peaceful political vision of never again would there be an organization that has the moral authority, the organizational capacity, and the vision to sort of fight for a lasting peace, kind of until October 7th. People can paint Hamas so much different ways, but the fact is Hamas has worked since October 7th. If you look at their demands they're advocating for, they want a renewed PLO. They want to partner with Fatah. They want to bring other organizations to the table. And so the Second Intifada, ends in kind of a moment of retreat that in a lot of crucial respects lasts until now. However terrible, and they're genuinely awful, it's a genocide right now. It's a moment born out of a sense that they can lift the game board and kind of reorganize the Palestinian resistance. I think you see crucially those differences in the First and Second Intifada in the tone and character of it. The Second Intifada is genuinely stems from frustration and anger at the failure of Fatah to concretize all the gains they made for the First Intifada. And it's effectively a testament to how the repression and growth and strength of the Israeli state requires a different kind of resistance, because they're our actions are constrained by what's come before us. What's that Kamala Harris quote everybody's talking about all the time now? And I wanted to kind of just end finally on like just a brief look at the March of Return in 2018, 2019, and just juxtapose like the distance from where they were in the first Intifada in the 80s to now, like a peaceful demonstration. People are just going every day to the walls, like they're going to the gates, and they're just demanding, they're assembling to demand right of return. And they're greeted with bullets. Snipers kill children, and like it doesn't provoke. Like there was genuinely like there were people outraged, but it did not have like outrage no longer has the political consequences for Israel that it once did. Yeah. And so I just sources. There's some books in there that I like on the Second Intifada. Yeah, and I feel like this is. Do we have time for a Q&A? What do we do now?
Yeah, let me just get my little spiel. Thank you, John, very much for all your hard work on the presentation. If you would like, I know many of you have already heard this multiple times, but I'm saying it again. Would like to sponsor a book to be distributed locally through Layers of Black History. We still have like half the books need some sponsors. So we have beautiful stickers for you to write your name on, and you can make a donation to our Venmo, or I can take cash. But thank you for coming. And if you're not hooked into HPC, please email us and we'll get you on our weekly listserv. And if you'd like to organize with us, we have an onboarding process. So yeah, all those materials are also here. Yes.
I like the CTA. The current one.
Oh, do you want actually Josh?
Yeah. So currently, there is an act in the state legislature of Pennsylvania, the Stand with Israel Act. It got voted through the Senate. It basically takes divestment off the table as something that public agencies can do. It would also, any school that engages with divestment will no longer have access to state money, which has a whole host of implications. So it's meant to make it so that college students can't protest. And in support of that bill, Doug Mastriano and Republicans on the State Senate Education Committee have organized the first, and what's probably going to be several hearings on campus anti-Semitism. And it's this Thursday at 10:30 a.m. in, I want to say, meeting room one. Meeting room one. Meeting room one, question mark. North Office.
You don't say.
And so
What time again?
10:30. And so our current call to action is to ask people to call the state senators on the education committee and just we have scripts, but to make a statement basically decrying like this like right-wing show concern for anti-Semitism, because they're trying to push the Stand with Israel Act, but they're also trying to launder Doug Mastriano's reputation. And yeah, so the current call to action is to call the senators and make a comment about that. You can check out the call to action on our Instagram page. And also, if you're available, please come. Come to the meeting. I'm going to be there. What, does anyone have any questions? I talked like a lot, so also sorry.
Well, one thing that you did mention, and it didn't really hit me until you said it. Currently in this conflict, it is about, so thank you. It just hit me when you were talking about it. When it comes to this conflict, it is mostly about institutions, it is about organizations, ideologies. But really, of us who would really know his face, maybe outside of Middle East and people who are concerned with that, very much concerned with it. I still remember seeing, some of my earliest memories watching these with my folks. I know Yasser Arafat's face anywhere. I know that name anywhere. There really isn't one defining face of the Palestinian resistance. And maybe the question therein is that actually a good thing? Is that maybe a productive thing that we're seeing more maybe organizations than we are one person? Or would maybe been the detriment of the Palestinian resistance?
Yeah, that's a super interesting point because there isn't like an overriding charismatic leader. And if you look at like how Hamas is, there's a really excellent book. I would say it's called Hamas Tamed, about which is like a lot of long form interviews with members of Hamas. But there is a split between the kind of external Hamas of like Ismail Haniyeh, who you might have seen, especially right after October 7th, kind of in Western media getting interviews about it, and the internal leadership of Hamas within Gaza. And, you know, for a whole host of reasons, they're not able to kind of cohere their security issues for the people in Gaza, not wanting to share information on the outside unless it's compromised. But then, as a result, as a consequence, like there's not like an overwhelming charismatic presence. There are figures that sort of live in the popular imaginary, like I'm gonna not say his name correctly, but Marwan Bartwin, who was a citizen leader for the first and second Intifada. He's a Fatah guy, and he's been basically in prison for a very long time. He's the #1 person that Hamas wants freed, and he is that because he has that personal cachet. People will remember him from the first and second Intifada. He doesn't have the stink of Fatah's governments throughout the Oslo Accords and subsequently, and he has legitimate political relationships within Fatah and even effectively undermined like Abbas. And so and I don't know how true this is because the reporting on the various like negotiations around freeing hostages and prisoners, it's like scattershot, but there were accounts like maybe 4 months ago that Israel agreed to free Bartwin in return for some of the hostages, and Abbas blocked it. Abbas, and so yeah, I like there isn't that overriding charismatic individual presence that can unite people, but maybe there could become one. I don't know if it's desirable, I don't, but yeah. If there's no more questions, I'm gonna just wrap this up so I can put the chairs back.
Is there time for one more question?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you pointed out that, like, especially with the second Intifada, that the Israeli public started to not feel so morally conflicted when they were doing violence against Palestinians. Could you speak the why?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like a really complicated question because there are people born in Israel who've been born there, and that's like all they know. And there's sort of like asymmetric information flow, and there's like a psychological dimension of not wanting to see your like friends and neighbors. It's like kind of jailers, ruling over an empire built on the backs of the dead. And so I think some of it is media emphasis on Palestinian resistance, which is then contextualized within a frame of reference where, Israel is like dignified and is merely defending itself. I think this is like a classic example of like ideology, like operating or whatever. But in like a more historical, sense, I can't point to specific episodes that have sort of like hardened the Israeli population. But Frankfurt School classic, the authoritarian personality, it's great on this stuff. Check it out. But if that's it, that's it. Let's put chairs away.
Right here. I don't need to go back.